Chris,
We're back.
End of another week. Just had tons of discovery calls this week. I know we got a lot in flight, and we thought it'd be a good chance to debrief here towards the end of the week/weekend on some of the most common discovery mistakes that are made. I think this is applicable both for SDRs and account executives. And also just a reminder for everyone watching, we are on Spotify if you do want to watch this on the go. But nonetheless, I know we were talking before, this is going to be certainly stories from our own career, and also I think some of the pitfalls of the modern training and influencers and kind of the quick headlines you get on LinkedIn of here's another question you should add in discovery. Some of these points are kind of cliched, but I think it's the long form conversation and the nuance and stories in depth that are really missing from a lot of what we've seen. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. What are your thoughts leading into this one?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think at this point we've not only been through like thousands of discovery calls ourselves, but we've also seen other people go through discovery calls. I am very rigorous and just like listening to top performers, and it's pretty funny, like you just start to notice like the pitfalls and the mistakes that other people are making, and you can look at somebody who has 4 or 5 years of experience, they can run a horrible discovery call, right? So it's just funny, like I think there's a ton of mistakes out there, but to your point as well is we're going to try not to make it sound too cliche, because to your point, I think the value is really in like breaking it down. But to kind of jump into it, I mean, I think the biggest one that I see personally being in like a high velocity segment is just not having a game plan, not being prepared, like just showing up to the call and you're like, all right, so tell me about where you're from and like what does your business do? And like I think you kind of have to show up with like a hypothesis, or it's even like in those first few minutes, right? Like when you start off the call like that, and unfortunately that is the reality of a lot of sales reps, right? Like that is how they go into a call. But what people don't realize is in those first 3 minutes of you like bothering them with like bullshit small talk and asking them those stupid questions instead of actually like having an idea of like, hey, I did some research, I saw XYZ, I found out about this. This is like, again, you don't have to go to that extent, but when you show up and you ask the same freaking question like every other sales rep, you're now being labeled as just like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first one. It obviously goes, it applies to the rest of the call as well. It's not just like small talk.
Yeah.
But I'm curious from your perspective, you've been through more discovery calls than me. And we're not just going to talk about the problems. We're also going to talk about like how to actually do these things right. Mm-hmm. So how do you go about it? And maybe before we even get into that, what is your stance on that? And then we can get into, how to actually do it right.
Yeah, I think, speaking to maybe the rep with a couple of years of experience, like I think this is something that is difficult because you can get lazy and you can kind of drop your guard and not do this preparation. I would say over time it changes. I do think, some companies and over time you have to use your EQ to like feel out the room. Some people are going to like that you've done a ton of research, and others are going to be like, okay, that's great that you know that Home Depot has 2,000 stores, but like,
yeah,
let's move beyond that, right? Like we have many challenges under the surface. So I think to your point, it's like how this has evolved for me over time. At first, I really liked being like a rep that had a lot of research and like came to the call and said, hey, I saw you guys are doing this and this. And like some people liked it, some people were put off by it. Now it's kind of like, I agree, I prep, I anticipate. So it's like I study, releases from the executive team. Are they investing in a cloud migration? It's like a very common one that comes up. Beyond that, did they, like I think Capital One as an example, like I prospected into them like way back. So this, I don't even know if this is current anymore, but they announced like $150 million initiative to like go to Kubernetes on AWS. Right. And so those are the types of things you can probe into. But I would say a level deeper is like when you get into these larger and larger companies, it's broken down by different business segments. So I would say if there's a nuance, and kind of where I'm driving at is I think if you're selling to like velocity accounts, showing up prepared is great because you're usually talking pretty close to leadership or people who have a real stake in this. Whereas if you're at bigger and bigger companies, you don't want to show up and tell like Capital One, like, oh, hey, I'm a venture card holder myself. Like those guys don't care. They're so deep in like dashboards and they're pulling analytics for like one of 20 segments in the company.
Yeah.
And so that being said, I think it's really important to get a sense for the entire business, make the asks up front of like, hey, I was researching, it looks like you're on the credit team at Capital One or like credit management. What all does that involve? Yeah. And it's more coming in and helping them define it. And then very quickly, instead of saying like, what does your business segment do? Like, that's cool. How many people are on your team? It's like, awesome. You're in the credit segment. Tell me more specifically what that means to you. Awesome. I know, I'm a Capital One user myself. Are you guys supporting customer facing applications? And you can very quickly get to that point without making those assumptions. So if there's a good nugget in there for reps, hopefully, I don't know if that was a bit of a tangent.
No, I think that's solid. And I think it just, like, to your point as well, it's like, it's layers, right? Like, you start off soft, but I think most people just don't start off at all. They're just like asking the same generic questions, like, hey, where are you at?
Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty sunny out there, huh? How about that sports team, And it's like, okay, if there are sports fans, then sure. But yeah, you have to get, a layer deeper. Sure, you can check out their background, talk about how they transition. That's a better start. But yeah, you have to get deeper and talk about what they actually care about, right? And obviously that's different from segment to segment, whether you're in velocity, SMB, enterprise. Obviously, like, enterprise strategic, you're mostly focused on actually like the overall holistic strategy of the org, whereas in velocity, SMB, it's a lot more like carved out. You're talking to the direct stakeholder and all those different things. So it just changes. But yeah, I think, quite frankly, I just don't see people showing up having done any research at all. Like, even 2 minutes of research is good. Like, even if you can just pinpoint that they just had a round. I mean, it blows my mind. Sometimes it's like, that is like, you can figure out whether they had a round in 15 seconds. And that doesn't just help you leave a better impression. It helps you actually, like, it gives you like a quoting strategy. If you know that they have money, if you know that they just raised money, right? Like, your entire strategy of how to navigate that deal, especially if it's like a recent development, changes entirely. But instead, people just don't take the time. And so instead, they're just left with like 20 minutes of talking about things that don't matter. Anyhow.
No, I would say one last thing on that. It's like one of the biggest deals I closed early on in my career. We had an e-commerce company that came in, and exactly to your point, like, for someone watching as well, when you're on a call, even the times where I've done my research, it's not like I'm like, hey, look at me, I'm an A student and I did all this research. Like, there was a time, and I remember this vividly, when I spoke to the co-founder and CTO. It was a very dire situation, but they literally, on TechCrunch, to your point, a quick Google search revealed they raised, I think it was an $18 million Series B like a week prior. And here he is checking out all this technology. And so when he comes in and says like, hey, yeah, we're making this big move off the database, I was like, oh, interesting. Like, I actually noticed you guys got 18 million in funding. Is this like part of that? And that opened a whole nother segment of the conversation. But it's like, you always pick your spots, but just giving a real example of like, you do this research not so you can come and say, I'm an A brown noser student, but you've got it. And I think it really enhances the discovery when you pick your spots and you have relevant and more abstract things, especially with engineers, to pull them out of like we're actually deploying using this, and it's like, okay, that's cool, but anyway. So I think we probably covered that one. So
no, I think that's solid. Maybe segueing into the next one. I think a good one to cover as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I see happening a lot too is just like not giving prospects what they want, feeling like you have to like fit into this very rigorous sales cycle of like all these frameworks that your company has paid like $2 million for. And obviously your boss is going to stress you about like not running a demo or showing a feature or giving pricing, but you kind of have to be fluid to a certain degree. Like, you can't just like withhold information. Like, if a prospect is asking for something, you want to, like, for instance, like if they ask for price, right? Obviously for most companies out there, you have to scope it out, right? But if you just tell them, hey, like, I don't know what to tell you, but like, you give them a range, give them something, right? And actually explain why that you can't give them whatever it is that they're looking for right up front. Because I think that like the key word there is like, give them an explanation. Right? Like, if you don't give them a reasoning behind why you're doing this, like if we went to a call, like we've been buying software, we've been buying services for higher levels. And so it's, excuse my language, but fucking annoying when a sales rep just sits there and is like, obviously just walking through his process. Sure, he's getting a bunch of ammunition internally to like fill out his CRM and Salesforce, but we leave that call and we're never going to talk to that person again. Right? Because we're looking for something very specific. And so I think the key is like, how do you uncover what you need to uncover in one ways that aren't super salesy, where you don't sound like some broken record, and two, where you're still like actually giving the prospect the information that they need. Although you might not give them the full context, but if somebody, like, let's say I deal with velocity, SMB, a little bit of mid-market, like budget is a huge thing, right? If I get a prospect that has 3 employees versus a prospect that has 19 employees, completely changes everything. right? And so like if I don't give pricing to 3-person company, I could also risk running 4 calls with those people, only for me to share the pricing on that 4th call and then be like, this is crazy. I thought it was going to cost like 20% of it.
Yeah.
And obviously right there, like you just wasted a ton of time. So it's not just like for the sake of you running some, forgive my language here, but like some stupid sales process.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that all of the frameworks and sales processes are stupid, but I think that they become stupid when people try to fit into them. Yeah. Right? It's like you're trying to put like a triangle into like a rectangle. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
Right? But I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I think when I joined tech sales, I think that the adage was very much like, don't give a demo until you've truly uncovered pain.
Yeah.
And like in an ideal world, I agree with that. However, I will say like selling to highly technical engineers, there are times where they know a lot coming into it, and I think somewhat rightfully, they just want to see a demo.
Yeah.
There are ways you combat that. And on the other side of this, I don't think you should just give something without getting something in return. And that's, as we talked about before this, like a separate episode entirely, because that's every stage of the deal.
Yeah.
But I do think now, especially more technical personas, and or if like CTO comes to the table and wants to see a demo, he doesn't have time for your shit.
Yeah.
Or she doesn't have time for your shit. Like just kind of give them what they want and say, usually in those situations, I will give them the demo, and along the way I say, hey, like completely understand, like we don't have to go through all of these different questions, but I do have 3 or 4 to make sure I show you the relevant things here. Because otherwise this is going to be a goose chase. I'm going to show you everything and I'm going to have no idea if this is relevant.
Yeah.
And as opposed to, I think the old adage was like, Chris, usually when people ask me for a demo, they, really don't have a complete understanding of what we do here.
Yeah.
I've seen that so many times. But and I think on the point of pricing, it's like also another miss. And honestly, when I first went to AE, I was like so nervous about pricing, and like a $250K contract seems so ludicrous to me that like I was like nervous giving proposals like that sometimes. Yeah. But at the same time, the flip side is like you as a rep should flip the script and say like, I'm protecting my time. Like, hey, you bring up a great point. I can't give you an exact number right now because this is a tool that does many things, but I think it's worth saying based on everything I've heard right now, if we're doing X, Y, and Z, we'd probably conservatively be looking at like 120K a year right now. Yeah. So I definitely want to avoid a situation where we have 2 follow-up calls, we look at a demo, and then the price was a deal breaker from the start. How does that sit with your team?
Yeah.
And so these are simple ways that you can, I do think the average buyer now is so much more educated and quite frankly doesn't have time for your shit, that like those are the simple ways that I do to address things that I think about 5 years ago would have been like, whoa, Eric's not running a proper sales call. It's like that buyers are tired of that shit. Yeah.
Well, yeah, also because like they're deeper down. I mean, there was a study, I think it was Gartner actually, and studies are one thing, real life is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But I think this one holds pretty true. I think like most buyers today, they're already like 80 to 85% of the way through the buyer's journey whenever they come to you as an inbound.
Yeah.
Outbound, obviously a little bit different. But whenever they come to you, they have a really strong idea most of the time, like what you actually do. Yeah. It might be like little details here and there, but I think the disconnect happens whenever you're withholding information, right? And so I agree with your style. Like me personally, I like to give like a range. So it's like, hey, like typically, for companies your size, it ranges from, 18K all the way to 55K. Now, you probably don't need everything in the 55K package. So my job, and the reason why I'm asking you questions right now, is to scope out like, what do you actually need? And so like, you just need to give them something, right? Because like at the same time, like if they walk away from there not understanding why you're not giving them pricing, they just think that you have like a perfect number on your screen and you're not sharing with them.
Yeah.
Right. And they're going to say, fuck this guy, like, or fuck this person. Right. Excuse me. But it's just like, it's funny though. Like as a salesperson, you don't think about those things because you train, you go through enablement, all these different things. But when you actually try to sit like on a buying committee, and we haven't sat like on a formal buying committee, like at the same extent of these like enterprise people that you're talking to, for instance, but we still feel it.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's still very, very real. So I think it's just give people an explanation for why it is that you can't give that information, why it isn't accurate, why that you need to actually ask more questions.
Yeah.
Because that's all that people are looking for.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
I think another one too, I mean, we were talking about it a little bit, but just like being fluid.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When I was first becoming an AE, and even when I was an SDR, like cold calling, I had this like weird need to like always have a script in front of me. I don't think there's anything wrong with having a script in front of you, but I think the problem persists in you trying to like go through that script in a perfect order, right? And the reality of things is like no call is the same. You're not going to go into a call and then, I mean, sometimes it might be perfect, right? And I think over time you kind of like, you get to like structure your entire discovery question guide or whatever else to be a little bit more fluid. But I do see a lot of people, especially new AEs, they make this really fancy, and I did it myself. So I'm not just saying this because it's like, we've all been there, right? Like we make this fancy entire Google Doc sheet with like all these questions. Some people have like 40 questions. I'm like, holy shit, like 40 questions? Realistically, I ask like 4 questions, right? Because we're diving deep, we're like digging into it. I'm showing a feature or whatever else, right? Like, but people have this, they think they need to get through every single question to have it be a successful call. Right. And so I think the theme of being fluid is a little bit more like, hey, obviously you need to know your shit. Product knowledge is a huge factor that comes into play there. But also like, you don't need to go through from A to Z. Like if they start talking about something that's important or that's a proxy for something else, go down that rabbit hole, stay on it. Like if you have to stay on it the entire call, if it's important and you can use it to uncover the rest of what's important to you as a salesperson, right? Like timeline, like stakeholders, all those different things, then do it. You don't have to get through your 12 discovery questions because that makes you sound like a salesperson, like a robot. And you're going to leave feeling like a champ. But again, we talked about this just a second ago. They're going to leave hating you. So
100%. Yeah. I think like, you know, that's something, it's good because that's a symptom that you over prepare. And I think honestly, at the end of the day, like I very much had symptoms of this. Like I would say year 1 and 2 selling to SMB, like I got super into all the training online, and it was like every week I was like, oh, finally I found like this amazing question from someone. And then I would add it to the repertoire. And I remember even training someone, I won't name their name, but it's like when they first started, they had that as well. And it's like, they would get on the phone with someone who, I don't know, let's just say they're like an infrastructure manager. And their first question would be like, well, how are you managing your infrastructure today? And the client would be like, hey, I appreciate you calling. I've seen what you guys do. I'm actually interested and was thinking about reaching out, but I'd love to know about this. And they were just like, okay, so like, how do you manage your infrastructure today? You know, and it's like you're just sitting there listening to the recording, like, dude. But yeah, I mean, same exact thing holds true. I think with the discovery, kind of like we talked about. And this is the nuance that I think is really difficult to do in short form or just like a script, where it's like even in a discovery call, it kind of goes back to the never give without getting type of situation. Like you have to be fluid, you have to be ready. It doesn't mean if the prospect comes in, no context, and they're like, listen, I'm not going to talk unless I see a demo. Like honestly, that person can kick rocks and like get them out of there. And that's a separate episode we can get into. But yeah, I think it's just, you know, so many people like, it's a great place to start, but when you realize that your script didn't work, I see so many people get like fight or flight, and a lot of people like, honestly, I think if you find yourself in that situation, the best thing you can do is like torture yourself by listening to that recording again and again, and it'll finally shake you out of just like having to do that every single time. But
no, I mean, it's funny too. We had a whole episode on this too, like just about why sales training is kind of what's wrong with it. I think a big piece of it is like, I don't even think that people really understand, right? Like you might be at like a top performing sales company. I mean, I'm going to be 100% honest. Like I see a bunch of people from Gong, for instance, like a bunch, and I'm not trying to like throw shade or whatever else. They're crushing it. They're doing great. However, I think that there is a misconception on their part, and I don't know if they're aware of it or not, but it's like they think that whatever they're saying or doing in their sales cycle, selling a product that is so infinitely far ahead of everything else in the market is going to work for somebody else who is either selling one, a completely different product, or two, just like in a much more competitive market. Right. And it's like, you can probably get away with a whole lot of stuff, right? Selling a product like that, and you will find all these reasons as to why you're crushing it. I mean, it's like salespeople are very, very notorious for this stuff, right? Like, like they'll close a massive deal, and it's funny, like, you'll go into the win wire and you'll see like just him taking or her taking a ton of credit for it. It's like, this was like an amazing team effort, the way we navigated this entire deal. And you'll go listen to the Gong recording, and it's like, they'll come through and they're like, hey, We've been planning for this like 2 years. You're the only vendor that can actually do this. So we just want to move forward. And sometimes like I reviewed a call at my last company, and it was literally Google Cloud that came to the table. It was 5 people, and they set the agenda. And the AE was just like sitting there on the call like to your point as well, they literally knew exactly what they wanted. Yep. And they were like telling the AE, like, this is what we need from you. This is how quickly we're going to get it, and XYZ. And it's like, they're so good at taking credit for that. So anyway, I'm getting down like a whole other rabbit hole here. Yeah. But I think the point I'm trying to make is like, you can't just go online and look at what somebody else is doing from Gong or from any other like, prominent company. I work at a pretty prominent company, Vanta. And so obviously like what's working for me, I know for a fact it's not going to work for somebody else. Yeah. It crushes maybe in my segment, in my territory, in my vertical, but other people shouldn't expect to just take that or buy some guide online and then think, yeah, this is it. Yeah. I'm going to crush it.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'd say, and I know maybe this is a good transition into one of the points we had for this conversation, is I also think this contributes to like happy years or that common phenomenon, because if you have that list of questions or you have that flow, it's like you may even have a prospect that is just kind of playing along with you, and you ask that first question, like, how do you manage your infrastructure? And they're like, oh, we're using Terraform with AWS and Azure. And you're like, oh, sweet. Yeah. Like, check.
I got it right where I want them.
What would you say, is there anything you would like to improve about that? And they're like, yeah, I guess, we're trying to get more team members to use it. And you're like, awesome. And it's like you've just missed so much. Where it's like, why do you want to do that? Have you tried to do that before? And again, it goes to there's no one answer here, but the more you do this, the more you understand your company, the more you talk to prospects that have real world problems, you can try and assert what that problem is. And you're not telling them, hey, most of the people I work with have problems with X, Y, and Z, because then I think sometimes you force them into like a bucket that they otherwise wouldn't. They would have given you a genuine answer if you didn't lead the witness. Yeah. And then there are, of course, other times where maybe the prospect is being a little bit quiet, and you do have to take the lead and say, hey, from everything I'm hearing, honestly, I work with a lot of people that are struggling with this. Mm-hmm. It sounds like this. Am I off base here? And like that may be an appropriate question, but using that every time, it just sets you up for failure, because you're more worried about like checking off your own cheat sheet or agenda than like having a meaningful conversation and solving a meaningful problem. So I don't know if that's enough of a bow on that one. I'm sure
No. I think so 100%. I think it also ties into just alignment in general. Like I think, even for me, like people will come in, I sell compliance and security software. And so people will come in, they'll mention that like, hey, these are the problems that we're having. A lot of the times they've never even heard about compliance before. Like some of these frameworks are so alien to them that they don't even know like what they don't know. Yeah. But I see a lot of people as well, and I was a victim of this when I was first starting out. I'm still like, ramping, relatively new in my role, so I'm learning something every single day. But I think one of the biggest learnings was like, they can say one thing, for instance, like SOC 2. I think most people know what SOC 2 is. For anybody else out there who doesn't know what it is, it's just like a compliance framework whenever you're selling to larger enterprises, vendors. But a lot of the times people will come through and say, hey, we need to take compliance more seriously. And then they'll say like, we've heard SOC 2 come up a lot. The average rep will say, that's it. Like exactly to your point, right? It's like SOC 2. That's what we're talking about. We're talking SOC 2, nothing else, right? Yeah. They don't even take a second to talk about like, okay, like anything else. Yeah. Like just like that isn't even the question that I would ask, but they don't even ask like any other frameworks, because there's hundreds of compliance frameworks out there. Yeah. And typically SOC 2 goes hand in hand with a ton of other ones. Yeah. So by the time that they're actually going to tackle SOC 2, you have a massive opportunity like as a sales rep to also tackle the other ones. Yeah. But most sales reps will hear one thing and then just hone in on like that one specific little thing, one little core piece of your offering, and then completely miss the fact that you can solve like maybe one of their broader problems, which is like, why are you getting compliance in the first place? It's because you want to like accelerate your sales cycles, right? You're not getting compliance because you want to be compliant. You actually are dreading going through compliance. Yeah. So how can we set you up for success so you can close these deals faster, prove you're compliant, and give you like an entire plan? And that can like double your ACV just by asking those questions, just by guiding them through the actual conversation. But I do see a lot of sales reps, not just in my own. I think most people at Vanta are extremely talented, so it's actually pretty crazy compared to like my last company and other companies. But I think like I do see a lot of sales reps make that mistake of hearing one thing, noting it down, and saying this is what the entire conversation is going to be focused on about, and you lose out to a lot of competitors that way too.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you don't have alignment and you think you're solving their biggest problem, then you get to the end and they're like, hey, this is cool, but your competitor has XYZ.
Yeah.
And you might have like way more than that, but you didn't do a good enough job of like uncovering it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
I think it brings so I mentioned the e-commerce example from my own career earlier. And that was like, that deal in particular was like, I had an insane run and it was like the golden child, if I'm being like, I don't know, maybe it's just in my head. And I was just like a young salesperson, like excited to get their first major check. But it's funny you say that because this manifests in different ways too. It's like I had literally an almost identical type of e-commerce company come inbound. They had a very, very similar pain in that they were using like our free stuff. It wasn't scaling anymore. They needed an enterprise grade solution. They were also doing a cloud migration. And literally it was like, at least on paper from a technical perspective, the same exact process. And I got like so excited. Like, yeah, I was like, this is perfect. And aside from many things I did wrong in that deal, it's funny. I liked your analogy of someone coming in saying like, we need compliance. We need to take compliance more seriously, and we need SOC 2. And I think, aside from getting too deep in the technical sauce, like that very much happened with this company. Mm-hmm. And I focused in on that migration. I focused in on the capabilities they were going to get with enterprise. And I didn't even ask why they were doing that. And I would imagine in your case, you know, the better question is like, oh, what other frameworks? I think an even better question is like, why is this important now? Yeah. And I'm sure we could get into that, but I think in my example, and giving a very real example, I got very excited, like, oh, you need the enterprise version. Like, why? And they were like, yeah, we can't handle peak workloads and all of the things that company said before. The biggest thing that I missed on is I got so excited because we solved their use case. And that worked, candidly, that worked in the last deal. But I got so focused on that, I didn't ask why they were doing a cloud migration because we were multi-cloud and we could be on any cloud. Come to find out, I didn't know the CEO was, I mean, I could tell he was a little bit older, but he was actually positioning for the company to be acquired. And I completely missed on that. And that was honestly the first time I got exposed to more of like an enterprise level sale, where it's not just about the immediate pain and problem to scale. It's more of like 4D chess of the actual value of the business and how they are thinking about it at the most macro level that candidly I was unexperienced for. And what ultimately happened is we had a POC, it worked and everything. But at the end of the day, because they were trying to be acquired, the CEO was actually willing to throw more money and was actually willing to give Google Cloud a huge amount of money to commit to go 100% on their ecosystem, as opposed to having our database be one component of that on the cloud. And sorry if I'm getting too deep for people watching here, but I think it's like, it's a very great example of this manifesting in different ways because, and I think this is where training misses, right? Because it's not that it's wrong, but like the training that we would have would give what your example, which was great. And the one that we talked about where it's like, okay, they say they want this. The average rep is going to say, great, that's exactly what we do. When you could ask this instead. And like, that's it. That's the training. Whereas like, I think real world examples go like, you almost have to be like paranoid, like burning through a pack of cigarettes. Like, okay, like how can I lose this? Like, what are the different ways that I can lose this? And I think the more you get reps and the more candidly that you take some brutal losses, you really start to get a complete picture that serves you well in many different ways. So yeah,
and you can still crush it, right? Like you can still, that's what I'm saying is like, it's ironic because most people when they go for advice, go for, you know, the LinkedIn influencers who are working at like a really good logo. Granted, we work at really good logos as well, but I think that we are pretty critical because we've worked at different companies. We've, you know, operated in a startup space with our own company here for, you know, over a year and a half now. So I think that we look at it a little bit more from a holistic perspective. But I think ironically when people go out and they start looking for advice, they take it from people who can get away with a lot of shit, right? Because they can like still close a bunch of deals because they're the only vendor in the space that's really filling that need to that capacity, right? So you can still crush it. But the question is it the best practice? Absolutely not, right? And so it's like this domino effect of like, oh, now everybody's listening to, you know, the Gong influencers or other influencers, and not saying like there is still a lot of good advice. So like, please, if you're a Gong influencer, don't grill us.
Yeah. If I worked at Gong, I would use your stuff.
Yeah. Like, don't get me wrong. Like there's a lot of solid advice out there too.
Yeah.
Like there's actually some people that post some really, really good stuff, but I also think that it's like a mixture, right? But I think for the people out there that are looking for advice, right, they end up looking at the wrong domino pieces because they think, oh, this guy's crushing it. He's working at this market leader. So if I take this, again, I think I've mentioned this like 4 times. I mentioned this like every single podcast. Yeah. But I mean, seriously, it's like, that's probably the biggest mistake I see happening is like, you try to make everything fit into like this one little thing. So
yeah, you don't take it for what it is and know the limits of where it's applicable and where it's not.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think moving over to another one, we talked a lot about like how, you know, you give and you get, and obviously you got to like cave in a little bit. You got to give them what they want. However, what we also see happening a lot is like reps losing control a lot. Like one, either the prospect takes control. It could be somebody internally. It could be an SE. I know that you have a very good story on that. It can be like it can even be your boss, to be quite honest, right? So there's a lot of different cogs that come into this, especially for inexperienced reps. When they just come into a conversation, they don't even like set an agenda or do anything, and it's like now the prospect is. I mean, for us, or for you more specifically, now I sell a little bit less of a complex sale now, but I think it's very, very easy. Like for you, for instance, if you get like a developer on the line, I remember this at HashiCorp too. You can spend 15, you can spend 2 hours talking about like EC3 or EC2 clusters, right? And then it's like at the end of it, okay, cool, but like, what now? Yeah. It's like, okay, we've talked about your configuration state and, you know, the next 6 months of like what you're going to be developing, but what's your actual problem? Yeah. Right. And I don't want to get too deep down the technical sauce or like the technical rabbit hole because we can talk about that all day. But that is a very real example, right? But I'm curious, I'll throw it over to you. You have a very good example on this. I think it's probably a little bit more tangible for folks. So
I'm waiting like a loaded spring, but No, I think this is a great example, like one to the customer. I think we've talked about that a little bit earlier on like if they come in and they say, hey, I just want a demo, or you get that like lower level engineer. Sometimes it's worth the call. Like, hey, if an engineer at Amazon comes in inbound, you're going to take the call, you know, but if they sit there and they're like, yeah, we're doing, you know, we really struggle with these configuration files and blah, 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 blah. It's like, okay, that's a niche case. But let's back up in more the sales engineer / AE dynamic. You know, I've been very lucky to work with like, honestly, I've had pretty solid SEs throughout. One example does come to mind though. And I think it was just like, again, it's like you get in the rhythm and your guard's not up. You're not taking each account like it's brand new because, you know, now, oddly enough, like the last couple of years, I've worked with like tons of restaurants. And similar to that e-commerce example I gave, it's really easy for me to hear like, I don't know, McDonald's, if they came in. I don't work with them, but like if McDonald's came in inbound, like in the back of my mind, I'm like, nice, because I've worked with like 5 different restaurants. I know what it's like to manage their POS systems, their website, their mobile app. But that's a bad thing because I don't come in curious and ask a bunch of questions. And so all that to say, I was working with Domino's and we had a call. They're revamping a bunch of stuff. They were going to start in Europe because it's less traffic than the US. We had global teams on the phone. We had one of their CTOs of Europe on the phone. And we got super deep into this call. And I just remember it was like minute 13. We spent the next 7 minutes going down and talking about one specific feature. Like, mind you, this was like an introductory call. The team was like, hey, we know we're going to use the technology that you're built on top of, but we are considering an enterprise grade solution. Thus why we're having this call. So we had to give them an overview of our platform. And I just remember like we were doing a harbor tour, showing them some of the most relevant things. And then I honestly let my guard down because the first 10, 12 minutes of the call was amazing. I was like, we are crushing it. These guys are like, wow, that's great. That makes everything way simpler and all this. And then we got to this point for like 7 minutes where we focused on this one thing that was like something they might do like 3 years from now. They were in the middle of a transformation and they were so early on into this transformation that there was no way that this feature would be relevant to any of them for at least a year and a half. And I just sat there and at first I was like, okay, you know, I'll let them show it just a little bit. And then some low-level engineer asked some question and he was like, oh, great. And like went really into the sauce. And then we got to like minute 21, 22 and everyone's just like, and I was like, so what do you guys think? And I just completely lost control because again, it's like right sizing some of the points we made earlier of being very fluid. Like, look, if you want to show the entirety of your platform, you can get there over multiple calls. But especially on these high level calls, especially the first time you're in front of like a CTO who just wants to like check the box of seeing the most critical and important features to them, Yeah, that was a huge battle scar. I'm sure I could break it down even more.
Yeah,
but yeah.
No, I mean, 100%. I think it's I mean, this is really where the best salespeople are found. I think it's like being fluid. I mean, all of the points combined is how, you know, I would look at like the best salespeople. I think consistently speaking, the people that are like top performers consistently, these are some of the traits that they have. But I think this is really where sales becomes an art. Right? It's like, it's about uncovering these things, doing it in a way that, one, you don't sound salesy, but second, where you don't lose control, where you don't go down some deep rabbit hole, right? Like, it's okay to say, hey, just to stay high level here for a quick second, like, I just want to make sure that we don't get too deep down this rabbit hole. Because a lot of the times, like, with an example for me, they think they need one compliance framework, right? When in reality, their entire market, maybe they've heard it once, right? But their entire market is in a completely different, like, regulation zone or area. And so maybe even like, and to give you an example, like SOC 2 is like a North American standard, ISO 27001, GDPR, or like European standards. So sometimes I'll get like a prospect and they'll talk about like how they need compliance. And they've had one person ask for SOC 2, but they're selling to a European market. And so the majority of the people are actually going to be asking them for ISO, right? And so like, you're not going to uncover those things, but if you just take whatever they say at face value and don't stay high level enough for long enough to actually like conclude that, then you're going to go down the wrong rabbit hole. Yeah. Right.
So well, I think it's also, if I could jump into, it's a great time. Like, for instance, you may have someone ask like, oh, that's cool. Like, what does that do? And say, hey, like, I've learned from that experience I mentioned to where if I'm on with an SC, like they're ready to go and they're willing to show that. And in many cases, that's a good thing. But you as the AE have to be willing to do the uncomfortable thing in that situation and say, hey, just a quick time check. That's a great question, Sarah. I don't know. And like, but I will say we've got about 13 minutes left. I'm curious, like, is that critical for you? Like, what's kind of the thought behind that specific feature? Yeah. And that way, to your point, it's like sometimes when you ask people, they're like, I don't know, like, SOC 2. Cool. Yeah. We had that one client say we need SOC 2, and you're like, awesome. Have you thought about this? And they're like, oh, interesting. No, I haven't. It's like, cool. SC, continue with what we were saying. You choke them out a little bit. Like,
no, 100%. Yeah. And everybody talks about this all the time. It's like, honestly, it's so bad. I might jump off a bridge because I hear it all the time. It's like, literally, excuse me, I'm sorry. But it's literally like people talk about being consultative. People talk about challenging people. Yeah. And then the examples that they give are so bad. Like, one, you don't challenge, or like, you don't challenge a prospect, or you're not consultative using some stupid guide, right? Like, that's the whole point of it, is like, there isn't a guide for being consultative. Yeah. Like, the whole point of it is that you got to reel it back in and tell them like, hey, no. Yeah. Like, but so many reps are just sitting there like, yes, right? Instead of saying, hey, no, actually that's wrong. Yeah. And then when, like, all of a sudden, like, I've seen so many CTOs or CEOs just sit there like this, and they're like, oh my God, yeah, we need compliance. Like, cool. You go through like 3 calls and it's like, all right.
And I was going to say, if I could make a footnote, that's the worst of it, is like, you let the demo go and you're like, you know what? Looks like we didn't have enough time, but this was a great call. How about we set up a follow-up? And you've come, especially when you have executives on the line, if you can't nail it, like if you set up a 30-minute call with the CTO, you are showing the most critical things on that call, and you are not audibling to have a second follow-up call. The CTO is not having that shit. So sorry, I just wanted to call that out. Like, that's a huge symptom I see.
100%. I mean, I think my most successful deals, the highest ACV, the most years and everything, they always come from like having some sort of revelation in a way, because they trust me. Right? It's like every other vendor is just riding the yes train, saying yes, cool, here's your quote, you want to move forward or what? And it's like, I literally had a prospect and they thought they were going to go one way. In reality, like, I just said no. And it was funny because I changed over to a route where it was actually going to be less ACV for me as a rep. However, because I did that, I could now mention that, like, hey, by the way, 6 months from now or 8 months from now, you might need this as well. And by the way, there's no better time than when you're first signing up for Vanta, my software, than now to get better pricing. Right? And so if you want to bundle these in, cool. But I already made them realize that they were on the wrong path. So now they trust me. Now I literally tripled my ACV just because they trusted me enough to where me putting 2 extra frameworks in the hat is going to, like, you know, they believe me. Because I made them realize that, like, one, they were serving the entire, like, I'm not saying that like they were serving the entire wrong market, but for what they're trying to do from a compliance standpoint, they were going for the wrong thing. So that's how you really, like, you are a successful seller, is you're consultative. But how do you do that, right? You don't do it by saying yes, and like, have you thought about it from this angle? It's like, no, dude, like, no, like, you just got to have the balls to say, like, no, that's not how it is.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, that's when they wake up. That's when executives are like, what did you say?
Yeah.
And then you talk to them like a real person, right? But they're giving you the time of day now. And if you're just sitting there, like, walking them through the classic sales spiel, sure, they might end up buying, but it's going to be like a low ACV deal. It's not going to be anything crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
No, 100%. Great examples. And I think on the SC side, like I said, I've been fortunate to work with a lot of great ones, but there's literally been times where, like, a customer will ask, I'm trying to think of more obscure past examples as opposed to talking about live deals right now. But yeah, it's like, I've literally had times where the customer will say, like, oh yeah, and we were really interested in this feature. And like the SC like shares their screen, and I literally, as the admin, turn it off and say, hey, we'll get there in just a second. I just had a few questions there to make sure we show you the right thing. And like, those are the tough things you got to do when you're brand new to being an AE, when you're excited about it. Like you kind of like, you don't want to ruffle feathers, and you convince yourself, well, yeah, they did ask for it, so like, let's see where it goes. But you get burned enough times, you get far enough in a deal cycle and realize you focused on the complete wrong thing long enough, you just get fed up with yourself and you're like, F this. And like, again, you don't want to overcorrect, but yeah, you just don't tolerate it. And I think you really control it from end to end. And that's a really hard thing to capture in like the trainings that we've talked about and all of those. So hopefully this sheds a light on it. So
100%. I know we're coming up to the end, so maybe we go through these a little bit quicker, because otherwise it's going to be like a 2-hour session. And obviously we're going to have a lot more of these, because this is what we do every single day. We're on the front lines. We focused a lot on like SDR breaking in, but I think, it's interesting enough, like there's just a lack of really solid discussion around these areas. Yeah. But I think maybe just to segue into the next thing, if you are in a competitive market, differentiating your solution, differentiating your product. Yeah. Right. If you're selling for a market leader, I'm not going to name any names, even though I've already done it throughout this call. But it's like, you might not have to differentiate as much. Yeah. Because maybe your marketing team is solid, they're crushing it, and you are a little bit more or less an order taker. Yeah. Right. I'm not discounting anything, saying that you can't be really, really good, have really solid market positioning. But all I'm saying is, like, you need to be able to differentiate your product and also do it the right way. Yeah. So like, I see two sides of that. I'm curious to get your perspective too. Is like, one, trying to just throw a bunch of random features in their faces instead of like actually trying to uncover like, hey, what is most important? Right? Because it's like, if you tell me, for instance, the most important thing for you is getting to compliancy the fastest possible way, I'm going to show you the time-saving features and map out specifically how, like, hey, this is how we differentiate. We're the only platform that has XYZ. This is why it's important to you. Yeah. However, if it's the second one where it's more like, hey, price, budget, it's like, okay, is it a non-starter if it's at this price? Or like, are you willing to, put a premium on something that's going to get you there faster? Like, if we're talking cost per automation, stuff like that, right? But it's like, if you just go through your classic spiel and your script that's showing like 15 different features, instead of like spending 7 minutes on one feature that specifically just like nails it. Yeah. Right. And then maybe like 4 minutes on another one, and then using that as like, okay, guys, we stayed high level. We've gotten to like 1 or 2 features, and I can do this because my sales cycle is super quick. So for instance, like for me, like if they tell me throughout the first discovery call out like, hey, this is what we're looking for, right? Or if they tell me that like it's competitive, they're talking to other vendors, I'll ask them like, hey, like, one, I'm not going to give you the classic sales spiel that you probably see on the platforms. They're all going to look very similar. That's because of XYZ. Maybe tell me what's most important to you. We can focus on that. And then if there's adequate interest, we can set up a follow-up demo and get a little bit deeper into the differentiators. So you'll show like the 1 or 2 most important things to kind of get like their foot in the door. And they'll say, oh, interesting. Like, because one, you're different from the other sales reps that are going through the same bullshit, going through the same script, right? But you're the one that's saying, hey, okay, you said speed was important. This is how we differentiate. Or you said like, hey, proving this outward facing is important. This is how we do that. Yeah. And if you think this is of interest, I would suggest XYZ. Now they have a reason for taking that follow-up call, right? Because and they're probably going to walk away from the other ones. So anyway, sorry. No. Very, very deep. But
no, really good. And I would say I think, differentiating means a couple of different things. I think to your point on when you have faster sales cycles, it's very much more so at the product level. And you do that by, I think, trap questions, and that's something we could definitely get into. But I remember as an example, like Amazon had a very similar on the surface product to what I sold when I first broke into tech sales in the database world. But what they often didn't realize, if they were talking about they needed to scale, or the other common thread where we were really differentiated was like support. we had the actual creators of the technology like on our team, and then Amazon basically took that technology and like licensed it as their own and just like put the AWS sticker on it. And so if they kept talking about scaling, or if they kept talking about support, it wasn't like, oh yes, and when it comes to scaling, we do this better than AWS. It was like, why do you need to scale? Have you tried to do that before? Like what what things have you and you keep asking down that track.
Yeah.
And then you kind of like at the end of it, it's like, oh wow, so based on what you've told me, even though you knew you were going to say this the whole time, I just want to point out a few different things. Like I encourage you to check out AWS, but one of the things you're going to notice that we do fundamentally different is this thing. And they're like, oh, interesting. And it's not even like a better or worse. It's like, hey, they do it different. Check them out. And you know for a fact it's like a 10 times difference between you and your competitor. The only other note I'd make more on the enterprise side, and there's always a million nuances. Like you said, we could talk about this forever. I think the biggest thing I'm seeing is it becomes more of like a platform play.
Yeah.
So of course you need to be differentiated, but when you get to the enterprise level, everyone's going to say they work with Verizon, they work with JP Morgan, they work with Apple, they work with Amazon.
Yep.
All of the one or two top market leaders have a footprint of their technology somewhere. And I don't even know what the best answer is going to be for you, but it's either going to be pricing in an unfortunate situation. Ideally, you're not there because that's just a race to the bottom. But really, it becomes more of like a platform and ease of adoption and use play. And that's such a simplification, but it's like, you could have a conversation with one engineer at a 20,000 person company and say like, yeah, we actually scale better than Amazon. And they're like, oh, that's cool. And then like there's so many things like if they have an existing Amazon agreement, that doesn't matter. But maybe you could get creative with pricing if you actually partnered and went through the marketplace. And then, so there's so many different angles. And I would say it really gets so abstract and further away from the product, where you need to know like several teams, which have several individuals within them, to really get some buy-in and find some commonality in terms of pain points, in terms of problems you can solve. And then especially where I'm at now, we have, I would say, 4 major products that we sell. It's trying to get them really up and running and successful with one, such that the other 3 become no-brainers. And it's like, well, you've made it this far. And obviously it's not like that cheesy or dumb, but like, it's a very different motion, obviously, depending on the market segment, the deal cycle, and all these different things. So hopefully that sheds light on it.
Yeah. No, I think it just comes down to like, again, like we talk about this a lot, but which segment that you're in changes how you differentiate as well. Like for instance, for you, I think it's a lot more not just about like current state, but like what about the future state, right? Like this solution that you're going to pick today, like honestly, they probably care less about that. They probably care more about like, hey, 12, 24 months from now,
5 years from now.
Stuff like that. Like what's that going to look like? And even like they know the costs associated with switching providers, or so like they know those things, right? SMB, velocity, even mid-market, they're more like, hey, we have this problem, let's just fix it. Like budget, whatever.
We try Vonta for a year, it doesn't work. Let's move on.
Exactly. So it completely changes, but yeah, that's all. We can go on and on for that one. So I think maybe the last one, this one's probably like everybody's heard this, or at least like 95% of people have heard this, but just setting next steps, getting something on the calendar, and just progressing the entire like deal or sales cycle. So I'll throw it over to you before I get my input on it.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the more you do this, I would also say like, yeah, sure, you should always set next steps if the call goes well. Conversely, if the call does not go well, there are times where I put it on the engineer or whoever I'm talking to like come to the table with more before we have another call. Like a very real example, even in the last like 6 months, I had an engineer from a very big and prominent company fill out a demo request, which is like, sick, let's go, because they want to do a demo. We got on the phone with them and they were just like, I don't want to get too specific, but it was very clear that they were just like, yeah, it was like a side project for them, and like there was maybe something there, but by the time I got to the call, it's like, or the end of the call, it's like I got more or less what they wanted to do. But then when I was like, so cool, I guess who's this important for? Like who all would want to see this when you're done? He's like, oh, I'm not totally sure. I guess my manager. And it's like, at that point, like, it's like, I mean, cut it off. Like, especially at a company with 100,000 employees, like if one of the lower level engineers thinks that maybe his manager would be impressed and can't tie it to any like website, any customer impacting issues, can't even put a dollar amount on it, cut it off, and in terms of like, hey, that sounds great. here's access to a 2-week trial. Let us know how it goes. What I'd like to recommend to make sure we make the most of this is if we could meet like with all of your team that would be, interested in seeing this. That honestly would help us a lot, and really we can help you like get this noticed.
Yeah.
So that would be what I recommend. Is that something you're willing to do? And if they say no, or they don't want to bring their manager to the table, cool. Let us know how it goes. Here's my information. Email me if you need anything. But I got way too many calls, way too many things I could be doing to worry about a low level thing. So back to your original point, like that being said, if the call goes well, I think a lot of customers will like, hey, sounds like there's a fit here. Typically what we do from here is X, Y, and Z, and like making them feel like there's a very structured process. It's not pressure, but like, what you're doing, you've done this before, you're only moving forward because this is a very real thing and you can help them, then that's a great situation. I'll let you expand on it. So
I mean, I think it's just about, you need to give yourself ammunition to associate value to that next meeting. I see a lot of people that are just like, hey, when do you want to reconnect? Like, for what? Like, reconnect for what? Like, do you have anything else? And it's like they haven't done a good enough job of uncovering something where they can anchor to. It's like, hey, in these situations, and to your point, like you do it so naturally, right? But it's just like, hey, in these situations, this is what we do, X, Y, Z, based on like how you want to see more of this. I know that we stayed high level. We talked on this feature, or I mean, ideally you don't even talk about features, but if there's something that you can talk about to where let's spend this next time, this next call talking about XYZ, showing you this and that. In turn, that's going to prepare your team and expedite your research process to help you make a more informed decision.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, if they don't walk away from that call with that, they're probably never going to show up to the next call.
Yeah.
But I think also like a very real thing that happens, especially like in my segment, is you can kill it, you can crush it, and they're going to like give you some resistance on it.
Yeah.
They're going to tell you like, hey, that's fine. Let me get back to my team. We'll talk about it. And then you never hear back from them again.
Yeah.
So like, honestly, like there's different situations. I think the most important thing is that you associate value, but then going a step deeper than that, like even then having that next step on the calendar, you can have very warm buyers and they just fall through because they have so many other things, especially like in startup land.
Yep.
Right. So maybe let's switch over to that for a quick second.
Yeah.
The way that I tackle that is just say, hey, completely understand. Maybe let's just throw down like a placeholder. We can move it once we get closer to it. But I think having something on the calendar to where that they see it, whenever you get close to that one, they're going to forget everything you just said, like during those last 3 minutes. So they're just going to be like, oh yeah, we have a call scheduled, right?
Sure.
But you come to that next meeting, or come time for that next meeting, like next Tuesday or something, right? Mm-hmm. Even if they don't show up to the call, they're going to give you an update, because that's just like human psychology is like, oh, should I have something on my calendar? I should probably tell them I'm not attending in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Of course, there's going to be people that don't give a fuck and just like not show up at all.
Yeah.
But I think the importance is just like, that's how you carry a sales cycle through from A to Z. Yeah. And it's so generic. People always say, oh, you got to have a next step on the calendar. The reality of why you're doing that is because it's like an accountability framework, right? Anyway, sorry.
Yeah.
That's how I'd break it down.
I'm in agreement. Yeah. No, I think like if it's qualified, if they're reluctant to show up, like, there's so many different situations. Like a lot of times now I'm working with existing customers of one of our products, but not of others. So yeah, pending the situation, like there's been times where genuinely they'll say, hey, this is really great. We loved what we saw. We're going to be in a really great position 2 months from now to really dive into that. Yeah. And like, yeah, that may be genuine, but I think to your point, yeah, for the prospect that's like a little bit flaky, you can tell that you have a great fit and they're just incredibly busy. Like the e-commerce company I mentioned that I signed, they spent well over 6 figures with us, and like it came time for renewal, and it literally got to the point where if the CTO didn't sign the renewal the second year, like we would have canceled their service. And like I literally just needed him to go in and hit the DocuSign. And I pinged him for like 3 weeks and he forgot. And I finally called him so many times, he just did it. So it's like, it is a very real thing to your point that people get busy. But I also think to your point, a lot of reps think that because it's super qualified, because you're really well positioned against your competitor or all these different things, that it's a done deal. And it's absolutely not, especially in these faster deal cycles. So much can change so quickly. So if you don't capture that momentum, if you don't bring it to a point, you just insert risk the longer and longer it goes. Yep. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think all of these topics here today, we could probably expand on throughout entire episodes. So we try to stay high level. We see this happening every single day. We experience it ourselves. We've done and made these mistakes many times before. That's how we learned it. That's how we essentially are able to talk about it today. But this was a solid pod. I mean, I think for anybody out there who is, either like looking to break into tech sales or an SDR, or you've been an AE that's just tenured, I think there's a lot of value in here.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any famous last words.
Yeah, I just, what's it like knowing you're never going to be able to work for Gong? That's the only thing, dude.
Yeah, it's funny. They're gonna like hit us with like a cease and desist, like yeah.
So anyway, all right, we'll call it there. We're on Spotify, and
don't forget to subscribe if you guys like this episode. This was solid.
Yeah.
Much love. We'll just stop it there before we get
more trouble.
Yeah.
All right.
Much love, guys.